The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, Chapter 4, Stopping Male Violence. Written by Bell Hooks. Read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz on May 28th, 2022. Stopping Male Violence. Every day in America, men are violent. Their violence is deemed quote-unquote natural by the psychology of patriarchy, which insists that there is a biological connection between having a penis and the will to do violence. This thinking continues to shape notions of manhood in our society, despite the fact that it has been documented that cultures exist in the world where men are not violent in everyday life, where rape and murder are rare occurrences. Every day in our nation there are men who turn away from violence. These men do not write books about how they manage to navigate the terrain of patriarchal masculinity without succumbing to the lure of violence. As women have gained the right to be patriarchal men in drag, women are engaging in acts of violence similar to those of their male counterparts. This serves to remind us that the will to use violence is really not linked to biology, but to a set of expectations about the nature of power in a dominator culture. Over the decades, no matter how many television shows and movies we have watched in which the hero is the good man who uses violence to win the fight with bad men, many people have long felt that feminist thinkers exaggerate the degree to which men are violent in their daily lives. Radical feminist Andrea Dworkin has courageously and consistently dared to name the widespread scope of male violence against women. In Scapegoat, she writes, quote, "A recent United Nations report says that violence against women is the world's most pervasive form of human rights abuse. In the United States, the Justice Department says that 1 out of 12 women will be stalked at some point in her lifetime." The American Medical Association concluded that sexual assault and family violence are devastating the United States' physical and emotional well-being. In 1995, the AMA reported that more than 700,000 women in the United States are sexually assaulted each year, or 1 every 45 seconds. These facts address actual physical assault and do not cover the widespread emotional abuse that has practically become an accepted norm in male-female relationships, whether between husband and wife, father and daughter, brother and sister, or girlfriend and boyfriend. In How Can I Get Through to You, Terence Real includes a chapter titled A Conspiracy of Silence, in which he emphasizes that we are not allowed in this culture to speak the truth about what relationships with men are really like. This silence represents our collective cultural collusion with patriarchy. To be true to patriarchy, we are all taught that we must keep men's secrets. Real points out Real points out that the fundamental secret we share is that we will remain silent. When girls are inducted into womanhood, what is it exactly that they have to say that must be silenced? What is the truth women carry that cannot be spoken? The answer is simple and chilling. Girls, women, and also young boys all share this in common. None may speak the truth about men. One of the truths that cannot be spoken is the daily violence enacted by men of all classes and races in our society, the violence of emotional abuse. In her groundbreaking work, Emotional Abuse, Marty Tam Loring explains that emotional abuse is, quote, an ongoing process in which one individual systematically diminishes and destroys the inner self of another. The essential ideas, feelings, perception, and personality characteristics of the victim are constantly belittled. The most salient identifying characteristic of emotional abuse is its patterned aspect. It is the ongoing effort to demean and control that constitutes emotional abuse. End quote. Significantly, emotional abuse in families is not just a component of the couple bond. It can determine the way everyone in a family relates. If a woman is patriarchal, it can be present in a single-parent home with no adult males present. In many homes, patriarchal power resides with teenage boys who are abusive to single-parent moms. This is male violence against women. When Real breaks the silence, the stories he shares are from family therapy sessions where clients openly reveal the way fathers have enacted rituals of power using shaming, withdrawal, threats, and if all else fails, physical violence to maintain their position of dominance. In my family of origin, our dad in a booming, angry voice would often scream repeatedly at Mom, quote, "I will kill you." For years, my nightmares were filled with an angry father sometimes killing Mom, sometimes killing me for trying to protect Mom. In our family, Dad was not consistently enraged, but the intense emotional and physical abuse that he unleashed on those rare occasions when he did act out violently kept everyone in check, living on the edge, living in fear. Usually a cold, silent, reserved man, Dad found his voice when he was speaking in anger. The two men I've had as my primary relational bonds in my adult life are both quiet and reserved, like my dad and my beloved grandfather. Unlike my grandfather, whom I never witnessed expressing anger, much less rage, these two men I chose as partners both needed to exercise dominance now and then through rituals of power. One of them was physically violent on a few occasions, a fact he always felt did not matter, and emotionally unkind quite consistently. My second longtime partner I chose in part because he was a major advocate for stopping violence against women, but as our bond progressed, he began to be emotionally abusive now and then. It was as though he felt that I was too powerful, and that perception empowered him to challenge that power, to wound and hurt. I was stunned that the past was being reenacted in the present. In self-help books galore, the notion that women choose men who will treat them badly again and again is presented as truth. These books rarely talk about patriarchy or male domination. They rarely acknowledge that relationships are not static, that people change through time, that they adjust to circumstances. Men who may have had seeds of negativity and domination within them along with positive traits may find the negative burgeoning at times of crisis in their lives. The two men that I chose as partners, like all the men I have loved, were victims of various degrees of emotional neglect and abandonment in their childhoods. They did not love their fathers or truly know them intimately. Growing from young adulthood into manhood, they simply passively accepted the lack of communication with their fathers. They both felt that all attempts at reconciliation should have come from the father to the son. And yet, as they matured into manhood, both these men began to behave not unlike the fathers whose actions they had condemned and hated. Observing them through time, I found that both of them had been rebellious and anti-patriarchal in their 20s and early 30s, but as they moved more into the work world, they began to assume more of the patriarchal manners that identify one as a powerful and successful man. Though they had not been living with their fathers when it came time to be men, the early models of their lives were unconsciously reenacted. They could have protected themselves from this intimate repetition only by consciously working to be different, only by being disloyal to the dominator model. No man who does not actively choose to work to change and challenge patriarchy escapes its impact. The most passive, kind, quiet man can come to violence if the seeds of patriarchal thinking have been embedded in his psyche. Much of the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde behavior women describe in men who are alternately caring, then abusive, has its root in this fundamental allegiance to patriarchal thinking. Indoctrination into the mindset begun in childhood includes a psychological initiation that requires boys to accept that their willingness to do violent acts makes them patriarchal men. A distinction can and must be made between the willingness to do violent acts and actually doing them. When researchers looking at date rape interviewed a range of college men and found that many of them saw nothing wrong with forcing a woman sexually, they were astounded. Their findings seemed to challenge the previously accepted notion that raping was aberrant male behavior. While it may be unlikely that any of the men in this study were or became rapists, it was evident that given what they conceived as the appropriate circumstance, they could see themselves being sexually violent. Unconsciously, they engage in patriarchal thinking, which condones rape even though they may never enact it. This is a patriarchal truism that most people in our society want to deny. Whenever women thinkers, especially advocates of feminism, speak about the widespread problem of male violence, folks are eager to stand up and make the point that most men are not violent. They refuse to acknowledge that masses of boys and men have been programmed from birth on to believe that at some point they must be violent, whether psychologically or physically, to prove that they are men. Terence Real calls this early indoctrination into patriarchal thinking the normal traumatization of boys. When I first began looking at gender issues, I believed that violence was a byproduct of boyhood socialization. But after listening more closely to men and their families, I have come to believe that violence is boyhood socialization. The way we turn boys into men is through injury. We sever them from their mothers, research tells us, far too early. We pull them away from their own expressiveness, from their feelings, from sensitivity to others. The very phrase, be a man, means suck it up and keep going. Disconnection is not fallout from traditional masculinity. Disconnection is masculinity. This indoctrination happens irrespective of whether a boy is raised in a two-parent household or in a single female-headed household. The perpetuation of male violence through the teaching of a dominator model of relationships comes to boy children through both women and men. Patriarchy breeds maternal sadism in women who embrace its logic. A great many women stand by and bear witness to their sons' brutalization at the hands of fathers, boyfriends, brothers, and so on because they feel by doing so they show their allegiance to patriarchy. No wonder then that male rage is often most directed at women in intimate relationships. Such relationships clearly trigger for many males the anger and rage they felt in childhood when their mothers did not protect them, or ruthlessly severed emotional bonds in the name of patriarchy. Contrary to popular myths, single mothers are often the most brutal when it comes to coercing their sons to conform to patriarchal standards. The single mom who insists that her boy child be a man is not anti-patriarchal, she is enforcing patriarchal will. Researching Boyhood, Olga Silverstein observed, in single-parent families it's common to see boys who have become their mother's little man. Often, these boys are very bossy children who patronize their mothers, who in fact do uncanny imitations of a certain kind of husband, being alternately possessive, protective, and seductive. Whether in single-parent or two-parent households, boys who are allowed to assume the role of mini-patriarch are often violent towards their mothers. They hit and kick when their wishes are not satisfied. Obviously, as small boys, they do not have the strength to overpower their mothers, but it is clear that they see the use of violence to get their needs met as acceptable. And while mothers of boys who hit them may feel that hitting is wrong, they may simultaneously feel that it is their job to meet the needs of any male, especially one who is coercive. Many teenage boys have a violent contempt and rage for a patriarchal mom because they understand that in the world outside the home, sexism renders her powerless. He is pissed that she has power over him at home. He does not see her autocratic rule in the home as legitimate power, and as a consequence he may be enraged at his mom for using the tactics of psychological terrorism to whip him into shape, and yet respond with admiration toward the male peer or authority figure who deploys similar tactics. In patriarchal culture, boys learn early on that the authority of the mother is limited, that her power comes solely from being a caretaker of patriarchy. When she colludes with adult male abuse of her son, she, or later a symbolic mother substitute, will be the target of his violence. Years ago, the television show The Incredible Hulk was the favorite of many boys. It featured a mild-mannered scientist who turned into an angry green monster whenever he felt intense emotions. A sociologist interviewing boys about their passion for the show asked them what they would do if they had the power of the Hulk. They replied they would smash their mommies. In her groundbreaking work, The Mermaid and the Minotaur, feminist theorist Dorothy Dinnerstein highlighted the extent to which boys respond to the autocratic power of mothers with rage. Like many feminist researchers today, she insisted that male engagement with parenting was needed to break this projection onto the mother as an all-powerful figure who must be rebelled against and in some cases destroyed. Clearly, patriarchal mothers who have rage at grown men act out with sons. They might either force the son to enter into an inappropriate relationship in which he must provide for her the emotional connection grown men deny her, or engage in emotional abuse in which the son is constantly belittled and shamed. These acts of patriarchal violence serve to reinforce in the mind of boy children that their violence towards females is appropriate. It simply feels like justifiable vengeance. Feminist idealization of motherhood made it extremely difficult to call attention to maternal sadism, to the violence women enact with children, especially with boys, and yet we know that whether it is a consequence of power dynamics in dominator culture or simply a reflection of rage, women are shockingly violent towards their children. This fact should lead everyone to question any theory of gender differences that suggests that women are less violent than men. In patriarchal culture, women are as violent as men towards the groups that they have power over and can dominate freely. Usually, that group is children or weaker females. Like its male counterpart, much female violence toward children takes the form of emotional abuse, especially verbal abuse and shaming. Hence, it is difficult to document. Maternal sadism must be studied, however, if we are to understand the roots of adult male violence towards women. To some extent, the reformist feminist thinkers who have focused on women as the more ethical, kinder, gentler sex have stood in the way of an in-depth study of maternal sadism, of the way women in patriarchal study act out violently with boys. In our household growing up, it was clear that our mother believed wholeheartedly that it was the role of the man to be a disciplinarian, to be in charge. When our dad used excessive violence, she merely saw it as his right. Lots of women who believe that it is the right of men to dominate feel that they should not resist male violence toward themselves or their children. Not surprisingly, these women, my mother included, use all manner of violence to discipline children. Fearful of being the objects of a grown man's rage, they may desire their children to be perfectly behaved so as not to arouse daddy's ire. In conversations with men whose mothers were passive as their sons were victimized by fathers or other male parental caregivers, I found that the men were far more likely than other men to idealize their moms, seeing them as victims without choice. While they did not direct anger toward their mothers and were often unable to even consider that she could have acted to protect their rights, these men were themselves violent in their intimate relationships with women. Their behavior affirms Terence Real's insight that the choreography of patriarchy, this unholy fusion of love, loss, and violence, spares no one. Mothers who ally themselves with patriarchy cannot love their sons rightly, for there will always come a moment when patriarchy will ask them to sacrifice their sons. Usually, this moment comes in adolescence when many caring and affectionate mothers stop giving their sons emotional nurturance for fear that it will emasculate them. Unable to cope with the loss of emotional connection, boys internalize the pain and mask it with indifference or rage. Usually, adult males who are unable to make emotional connections with the women they choose to be intimate with are frozen in time, unable to allow themselves to love for fear that the loved one will abandon them. If the first woman they passionately loved, the mother, was not true to her bond of love, then how can they trust that their partner will be true to love? Often, in their adult relationships, these men act out again and again to test their partner's love. While the rejected adolescent boy imagines that he can no longer receive his mother's love because he's not worthy, as a grown man he may act out in ways that are unworthy and yet demand of the woman in his life that she offer him unconditional love. This testing does not heal the wound of the past, it merely reenacts it, for ultimately, the woman will become weary of being tested and end the relationship, thus reenacting the abandonment. This drama confirms for many men that they cannot put their trust in love. They decide that it is better to put their faith in being powerful, in being dominant. In Man Enough, Frank Pittman says of men that, quote, while most of us want to be loved, controllers are willing to forgo love if that is what it takes to be the boss, end quote. Being the boss does not require any man to be emotionally healthy, able to give and receive love. Ever since I started writing about love, I have defined it in a way that blends M. Scott Peck's notion of love as the will to nurture one's own and another's spiritual and emotional growth, with Erich Fromm's insight that love is action and not solely feeling. Working with men who want to know love, I have advised them to think of it as a combination of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. Most of our relationships have one or two of these aspects. Patriarchal men are schooled in the art of being responsible and giving instrumental care. As a teenager, when I complained about Dad's emotional neglect and abuse and his sporadic violence to Mama, she was always quick to remind me that he worked hard and he provided for his family and that he was home almost every night, and for that reason alone we should respect and honor him. The fact that men often mix being caring and being violent has made it hard for everyone in our culture to face the extent to which male violence stands in the way of males giving and receiving love. The first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. If an individual is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem. Feminist movement offered to men and women the information needed to challenge this psychic slaughter, but that challenge never became a widespread aspect of the struggle for gender equality. Women demanded of men that they give more emotionally, but most men really could not understand what was being asked of them. Having cut away the parts of themselves that could feel a wide range of emotional responses, they were too disconnected. They simply could not give more emotionally or even grasp the problem without first reconnecting and reuniting the severed parts. Describing a couple in family therapy, Rial recalls the qualities the wife wanted from her husband: sensitivity to others, the capacity to identify and share his feelings, a willingness to put his needs aside in the service of the family. These are the same qualities, Rial points out, that most boys, even in these enlightened times, have had stamped out of them. He concludes, in our culture, boys and men are not, nor have they ever been, raised to be intimate. Women seeking intimacy from men often find their expressions of longing belittled. Many men respond to females wanting emotional connection with emotional withdrawal, and in worst-case scenarios with abuse. Emotionally self-mutilated, disconnected, many men make overtures of emotional connection, only to later undermine these with emotional abuse. They simply do not get that love and abuse cannot go together. And why should they get it? Why should they, when television shows, movies, and so much else in popular culture gives the message that at any time there's intense passion between a couple, violence can erupt? Teaching men to understand that women and children do not feel loved when they are being abused is one of the primary goals of groups that work to end male violence. Kay Lee Hagen's autobiographical essay, A Good Man is Hard to Bash, begins with the story of her dating a man who she felt was abusive and was potentially capable of physical violence. She calls his best male friend for advice about how much abuse she should endure, saying, if I'm serious about him and if I want the relationship to work, to last, there will be ups and downs. I don't think I should run away when it gets hard. I should be willing to tolerate a little abuse if I really love him. The friend looks her directly in the eyes and tells her, Kay, in a loving relationship, abuse is unacceptable. You should not have to tolerate any abuse to be loved. With characteristic boldness and radical honesty, Hagen shares that her understanding of love and power changed forever in that moment. She had imagined that her lover's friend would take his side. Instead, his reaction encouraged me to love myself, to take responsibility for my own well-being, and to reject violence even in its subtler forms. Hagen was lucky to receive this wisdom early in life. The fate of most women is dramatically different, especially females who worship at the throne of patriarchy. These women feel, as Hagen did initially, that to choose to be with a patriarchal man is automatically to sign up for some level of abuse, however relative. Every day, women explain away male violence and cruelty by insisting on gender differences that normalize abuse. Heterosexual women who are single and want to be with men feel that they cannot escape being victimized at some point by emotional and/or physical abuse at the hands of male partners. Collective female acceptance of male violence in love relationships, even if the appearance of acceptance masks rage, fear, or outright terror, makes it difficult to challenge and to change male violence. When the seemingly mild-mannered professor I lived with moved from emotional abuse to physical violence, I felt I should be understanding, forgiving. Like me, he had been raised in a dysfunctional family. However, even though he went to therapy, even though his physical violence stopped, he never really believed that he had done anything wrong. He harbored the notion, as many men who act violently do, that I was responsible for his bad behavior. In Donald Dutton's work with men who are violent, he identifies women seeing behind the male mask as a catalyst for male violence. Quote, "He may apologize and feel shame immediately after, but he can't sustain that emotion. It's too painful, too reminiscent of hurts long buried. So he blames it on her. If it happens repeatedly with more than one woman, he goes from blaming her to blaming them. His personal shortcomings become rationalized by an evolving misogyny. And at this point, the abusiveness is hardwired into the system. The man is programmed for intimate violence." End quote. Often men who have been emotionally neglected and abused as children by dominating mothers bond with assertive women, only to have their childhood feelings of being engulfed surface. While they could not smash their mommy and still receive her love, they find that they can engage in intimate violence with partners who respond to their acting out by trying harder to connect with them emotionally, hoping that the love offered in the present will heal the wounds of the past. If only one party in a relationship is working to create love, to create the space of emotional connection, the dominator model remains in place and the relationship just becomes a site for continuous power struggle. Women who stay in long-term relationships with men who are emotionally abusive or violent usually end up closing the door to their hearts. They stop working to create love. Often they stay in those relationships because a basic cynicism rooted in their experience affirms that most men are emotionally withholding, so they do not believe that they can find a loving relationship with any man. When I wanted to leave my first longtime partner, who had been continuously emotionally abusive and occasionally physically abusive, it was other women, my mother, close friends, acquaintances, who cautioned me about ending the relationship, letting me know that the man I was with was better than most men and that I was lucky. Leaving him was a gesture of self-love and self-reliance that I have not regretted. Yet I found that the observations of the women who cautioned me about what most men were like were fairly accurate. The man I had lived with in partnership for almost 15 years exhibited a mixture of patriarchal masculinity and alternative masculinity. We met during the heyday of feminist movement, and he was willing to work at creating gender equality. As it is for many men today, it was much easier for him to accept equal pay for equal work, sharing housework and reproductive rights than it was for him to accept the need for shared emotional development. It is more difficult for men to do the work of emotional development because this work requires individuals to be emotionally aware, to feel. Patriarchy rewards men for being out of touch with their feelings. Whether engaged in acts of violence against women and children or weaker men, or in the socially sanctioned violence of war, men are better able to fulfill the demands of patriarchy if they do not feel. Men of feeling often find themselves isolated from other men. This fear of isolation often acts as the mechanism to prevent males from becoming more emotionally aware. When large numbers of young men in this nation rebelled against patriarchy to oppose the war in Vietnam, many of them were concerned with justice. Many of them did not want to kill, but a great many simply did not want to die. To oppose war and the imperialism that promotes war placed these young men at odds with imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. They suffered by choosing to take a stand. They were ridiculed by other men, more often than not represented as traitors. In the past 10 years, mass media have produced a number of movies aimed at boys that glorify war: Saving Private Ryan, Independence Day, Men in Black, Black Hawk Down, Pearl Harbor, just to name a few, that once again make it appear heroic to die alone, away from home, fighting for a cause you may or may not understand. These movies are part of patriarchal anti-feminist backlash. They glorify the patriarchal masculinity that enlightened women and men critique. They serve as propaganda, recruiting the hearts and imaginations of boys. Like gangster rap, they celebrate male violence on all fronts, including the domination of women. Conservative mass media offer daily lessons in patriarchal pedagogy. They tell boys what they must do to be men. In those homes where enlightened fathers daily work to repudiate violence, television reaffirms its importance, making courting death glamorous and sexy. Poor and working-class male children and grown men often embody the worst strains of patriarchal masculinity, acting out violently because it is the easiest, cheapest way to declare one's manhood. If you cannot prove that you are much of a man by becoming president, or becoming rich, or becoming a public leader, or becoming a boss, then violence is your ticket into the patriarchal manhood contest, and your ability to do violence levels the playing field. On that field, the field of violence, any man can win. Men who win on patriarchal terms end up losing in terms of their substantive quality of life. They choose patriarchal manhood over loving connection, first foregoing self-love, and then the love they could give and receive that would connect them to others. Feminist researchers have long since exposed the widespread domestic violence in our society. Yet since that exposure, violence against women has not declined, and in some cases it has intensified. Anti-feminist pundits seek to blame the intensification of male violence on women's greater equality, yet most studies of family life indicate that in that sphere, gender relations did not undergo any major revolution. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild has provided important data showing that domestic gender dynamics between men and women remain fairly sexist. Women work outside the home, but continue to do the lion's share of work in the home. Of course, men who were covert misogynists before feminist movement felt more entitled to unleash their rage overtly as that movement gained momentum, but the rage was already present before. Male violence in general has intensified not because feminist gains offer women greater freedom, but rather because men who endorse patriarchy discovered along the way that the patriarchal promise of power and dominion is not easy to fulfill, and in those rare cases where it is fulfilled, men find themselves emotionally bereft. The patriarchal manhood that was supposed to satisfy does not, and by the time this awareness emerges, most patriarchal men are isolated and alienated. They cannot go back and reclaim a past happiness or joy, nor can they go forward. To go forward, they would need to repudiate the patriarchal thinking that their identity has been based on. Rage is the easy way back to a realm of feeling. It can serve as the perfect cover, masking feelings of fear and failure. My father and mother have been married now for more than 50 years. Dad has never relinquished his patriarchal status, and she has never challenged it. Yet by clinging to patriarchal thinking, they forfeited their chance to be happy together. The threat of violence, of emotional abuse, is always there, standing in the way of intimacy, keeping them from forgiving one another and starting over. Sadly, they are stuck in the trap of patriarchy, and it remains the breeding ground for everyday violence, the subtle, intimate terrorism that intensifies resentment and closes off the possibility of knowing joy. It is not easy for males, young or old, to reject the codes of patriarchal masculinity. Men who choose against violence are simultaneously choosing against patriarchy, whether they can articulate that choice or not. In his insightful essay, Gender Politics of Men, R.W. Connell calls attention to the fact that men who oppose patriarchy remain at odds with the world they are living in. Quote, "Men who try to develop a politics in support of feminism, whether gay or straight, are not in for an easy ride. They are likely to be met with derision from many other men and from some women. It is almost a journalistic cliché that women despise sensitive New Age guys. They will not necessarily get warm support from feminist women." Unquote. Ultimately, the men who choose against violence, against death, do so because they want to live fully and well, because they want to know love. These are men who are true heroes, the men whose lives we need to know about, to honor and remember. This has been Chapter 4 of The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, written by Bell Hooks and read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz.